In tonight's episode, we'll explore two chilling mysteries from across Asia, two stories that continue to haunt the people who live closest to them. The first one takes us back to the quiet suburbs of Kyoto, Japan, a neighborhood that looked safe, peaceful, and ordinary. But in the spring of 1954, something happened there that no one could ever explain. The Tanaka family were well respected in their community, 6 members in total. They lived quietly, kept to themselves, and never drew much attention. And then, one night, everything changed. Neighbors recalled hearing low voices drifting from the home, almost like chanting. The air was thick with the smell of incense, curling into the night. But the Tanakas weren't known to be religious. In fact, nothing about them suggested ritual or prayer. By morning, the house was silent, completely still. The family was gone. No one saw them leave, no one heard a struggle, and no one could explain why the dining table was still set for breakfast. Shoes were neatly arranged by the door. A teapot sat warm on the stove. The family had vanished, as if lifted out of their lives mid-breath. What happened to them? Tonight, we open the door to a story that Kyoto residents still whisper about under the moonlight. A story of shadows, rituals, and an unanswered disappearance. The Tanaka family lived in a modest 2-story home just outside the heart of Kyoto. In the 1950s, this was a neighborhood of winding lanes, soft lantern light, and quiet evenings broken only by the distant sound of temple bells. Their house stood at the edge of a narrow street lined with cherry trees that bent toward one another in spring, forming a tunnel of blossoms. To any outsider, it looked idyllic, a place where nothing extraordinary could ever happen. But to those who lived nearby, there was always something about the Tanaka home that felt slightly different, though no one could ever put it into words. The family themselves seemed ordinary enough. Hiroshi Tanaka, the father, worked for the railway. His wife, Emiko, tended to the children, 3 young boys and a daughter, their laughter often heard in the evenings as they played outside. By all accounts, they were polite, respectful, and never brought shame or scandal to the community. They ate together, walked to school together, and bowed to neighbors when passing by. Nothing suggested that their lives would be cut away so suddenly, leaving only questions and unease in their wake. The setting for this story is important. 1954 was a strange time in Kyoto. The city was rebuilding from the scars of war. But in the shadows of new construction and modern lights, the old world still breathed. Shrines tucked in alleys still carried their offerings. Monks still walked barefoot at dawn. Whispered beliefs, inherited through generations, lingered in households like the smell of smoke that clings to walls. People didn't speak about it openly, but they knew certain places held a weight, a thinness in the air, where the world of the living brushed too close to something else. The Tanaka family's purpose in life was simple: survival, stability, raising children in a world that felt uncertain. Their days moved in rhythm with routine. Morning tea, shoes by the door, children off to school, evenings of rice and miso soup. Hiroshi's shift at the railway was steady, dependable. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They lived somewhere in between, content with what they had, which is why their disappearance shook not just the neighborhood, but the entire district. Ordinary people aren't supposed to vanish in such extraordinary ways, and yet the first hints of something wrong didn't appear in the daylight. They came in whispers, drifting through paper-thin walls. Neighbors told of hearing a sound one night that was not quite singing, not quite prayer. It was chanting, low and steady, the kind of rhythm that seeps into your bones before your mind can make sense of the words. Along with it came the sharp smell of burning incense. Thick, heavy, clinging to the throat. Some thought maybe the Tanakas had taken up new religious practices. Others felt uneasy because the words were unfamiliar, not the soothing repetition of Buddhist sutras, but something older, harsher, almost urgent. What made it more unsettling was the family's reputation. They had never shown interest in rituals or temples. Hiroshi was practical, almost skeptical. Emiko was quiet, soft-spoken, not the type to lead a household into strange ceremonies. And yet, on that night, the air around their home was filled with sounds and scents that didn't belong. Dogs barked restlessly, then fell silent. A window slammed shut, though there was no wind. The next morning, when the neighborhood woke to silence, the mood had shifted. The Tanaka house stood like a stage, abandoned mid-performance. Curtains drawn, breakfast laid out, but untouched. Shoes neatly by the door, waiting for feet that would never return. Inside, the teapot was still warm, as if someone had left it only moments before. And on the walls, in broad strokes of soot or ash, were characters no one recognized at first. Strange, jagged symbols belonging to an obscure sect of Shugendo. Words that spoke of purification, of crossing boundaries, of leaving the flesh behind. It was here, in this setting of everyday normality cracked open by something unexplainable, that the Tanaka family's story truly began. Their home, once just another quiet place in Kyoto, became a wound in the neighborhood, a reminder that even the most ordinary lives can vanish overnight, leaving nothing but questions carved into the walls. It began with something small, a detail most people would have dismissed, if not for what followed. On the evening before the Tanaka family vanished, several neighbors reported the same peculiar sound drifting from the home. At first, it was faint, like a murmur carried on the breeze. But as the night deepened, the sound grew steadier, forming into what everyone later described as chanting. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was low, deliberate, like a steady pulse of voices echoing in unison. The strange part was that no one in the family was known to practice such rituals. A neighbor named Mrs. Saito, who lived just across the narrow street, said she noticed the smell first. She had been closing her sliding doors when the sharp bite of incense caught her nose. It was thick and bitter, unlike the gentle fragrance usually burned for prayer. She peeked outside and saw faint smoke curling from the Tanaka home, slipping out through the gaps in the shutters. At first, she thought it might be a small fire, but then she saw light flickering, not the yellow glow of a lamp, but something sharper, shifting, as if flames were dancing within. Curious, she stepped outside to listen. That was when she heard it clearly. Voices, layered together, repeating words she could not understand. They were not Buddhist sutras, she later insisted. They lacked the calm cadence of a temple chant. Instead, they sounded raw, almost guttural, as though each syllable scraped against the walls of the throat. She stood there, frozen, until the hairs on her arms rose. Then she hurried back inside, sliding the door shut with trembling hands. Other neighbors reported similar things. A passing delivery boy claimed he saw shadows moving inside the house, though the silhouettes looked wrong. They were too tall, too long, their limbs bending strangely against the glow. He thought he saw someone standing at the upstairs window, but when he glanced back a moment later, it was gone. None of these details seemed threatening at first. Strange, yes, but not dangerous. People told themselves it was nothing more than the family experimenting with some forgotten ritual, or perhaps a gathering of distant relatives performing something unusual. Yet the mood that night was unsettled. Even the neighborhood dogs seemed disturbed. They barked in sudden bursts, then fell into uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on the Tanaka home. Inside the house, no one truly knows what happened, but fragments of the aftermath painted a disturbing picture. When the authorities entered later, they found the breakfast table set with care. Bowls and chopsticks neatly arranged, rice still sitting in the cooker, shoes aligned perfectly at the door, as if everyone had stepped out politely. The teapot was still warm on the stove, its lid tilted slightly open. These details suggested no panic, no hurried departure. Instead, it felt like the family had simply paused in the middle of routine and never returned. The first undeniable complication appeared on the walls. Black markings smeared across the paper panels and plaster. Characters written in soot or ash. Large strokes that spread like veins. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, structured, though few could read them. Later, a local scholar identified them as belonging to a little-known branch of Shugendo, a mountain ascetic tradition mixing Buddhism, Shinto, and shamanistic practices. The words spoke of purification, of shedding the physical self, of crossing into another realm, but the oddest part was this. The Tanakas had no connection to Shugendo. No one in the family had ever been seen climbing sacred mountains, no history of spiritual retreat, no ties to any sect. To see their home suddenly covered in symbols belonging to such a path was unsettling, as if someone, or something, had imposed the ritual upon them. This detail became the first real obstacle for investigators. Who had written the symbols? Was it the family themselves, or an intruder who entered the house that night? The soot seemed fresh, smeared by human hands, but there were no fingerprints, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. The ash clung to the walls as if it had always been there, staining the paper and plaster beyond repair. Some locals claimed they had seen faint shapes flickering in the upper windows during the night. Not people exactly, but shadows bending unnaturally, stretching like smoke across the glass. One man swore he saw the silhouette of a child pressed against the paper screen, only for it to melt away when he blinked. These glimpses were fleeting, leaving only unease and doubt. At this point, the events were strange but not yet horrific. A family missing, a house filled with unexplained writing, and neighbors whispering about sounds they could not describe. No bodies, no blood, no signs of violence. The authorities treated it as a disappearance, a case of people who had perhaps fled or been taken under unusual circumstances. But the details didn't add up. Why leave breakfast set? Why leave shoes behind? Why leave a teapot still warm on the stove? The question that haunted everyone was simple yet unanswerable. If the Tanakas had left on their own, where had they gone? And if they had not, then who or what had come to take them? That was the first complication. A house too ordinary to inspire suspicion, suddenly filled with symbols, smells, and sounds no one could explain. A family too predictable to invite scandal, suddenly gone without a trace. A disappearance that raised more questions than it answered, leaving the neighborhood with the unsettling sense that something unnatural had brushed against their quiet lives and chosen the Tanakas as its mark. The investigation into the Tanaka disappearance should have brought clarity, but instead it pulled the neighborhood deeper into unease. The first layer of tension came when officers began speaking with neighbors. Almost everyone had noticed something unusual the night before, but their accounts grew stranger with every telling. One woman swore she saw Emiko Tanaka, the mother, standing in the doorway after midnight. She was motionless, her head tilted as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. The woman waved to her, but Emiko didn't respond. She simply closed the door without a word. Another neighbor described seeing all 4 children standing in the upstairs window, their faces pale against the glow of flickering light, as if illuminated from below. Yet no one saw them leave the house. Then came the second strange event. A patrol officer who entered the home in the days after the disappearance collapsed suddenly in the hallway. He later claimed the air was thick, pressing against his chest, as if invisible hands had squeezed his lungs. When he came to, he whispered that he heard voices murmuring behind the walls, not from a single direction, but from all sides, weaving together in a rhythm like chanting. His partner dismissed it as nerves, but word of his breakdown spread quickly, and soon even the officers became hesitant to enter the house alone. The conflicting character emerged in the form of a local monk, an older man from a small temple on the outskirts of Kyoto. He had heard rumors of the case and arrived uninvited, insisting he needed to see the home for himself. The police treated him as a nuisance at first, but his presence unsettled them because he recognized the soot markings on the walls instantly. They were not the work of ordinary shugendo, he claimed, but of a fringe sect that had long been outlawed. Their rituals sought to strip the spirit from the body, forcing it across the boundary between life and death. His words clashed with the official investigation, which preferred explanations grounded in logic, perhaps a kidnapping, perhaps a carefully staged disappearance. But the monk stood firm, warning that the family had been taken not by criminals, but by forces that should have been left untouched. He told the officers to burn incense before returning to the home, or risk being drawn into the same fate. Some scoffed at his advice, but others quietly followed it, stuffing pockets with protective charms. And then came the strange clue. Hidden beneath the dining table, scratched faintly into the wood, was a single phrase written in hurried characters. "Do not follow." It was barely visible, as if carved with the edge of a fingernail. The writing looked shaky, uneven, but it was undeniably Japanese. Investigators debated endlessly whether it had been written by a member of the Tanaka family or by someone who entered after them. The phrase deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Who had left the warning, and what did it mean? The atmosphere around the Tanaka home grew heavier with each passing night. Locals avoided walking past it after dark. Those who did claimed to see shapes flickering in the windows, though the house remained empty. Some swore they saw shadows stretching unnaturally across the shoji screens, too large to belong to the missing family. Others described hearing the faint clink of porcelain, as if the breakfast table inside was still being set and reset endlessly. Tensions escalated when a group of young men dared each other to approach the home at night. They returned pale and shaken, insisting they saw movement inside. One boy said he saw a child's hand press against the paper wall, leaving behind a dark stain that faded as he watched. Another heard footsteps pacing above him, though the second floor was empty. They ran before they could see more, leaving their sandals scattered at the threshold. The investigation stalled. With no bodies, no footprints, no signs of violence, the police could do little but file the case as unsolved. Yet the locals refused to believe it was over. The monk returned once more, standing before the home in silence. Finally, he warned the neighborhood that the ritual inside had not been completed. Whatever force had taken, the Tanakas had not finished its work. If disturbed, it might seek another family to claim. His words left a chill on the community, dividing those who dismissed him as superstitious from those who began leaving offerings at their doors. The unanswered questions stacked higher and higher. Who wrote the warning? Why did the chanting sound so unlike any known ritual? How could an entire family vanish without a trace? And why, even after the police sealed the house, did shadows still flicker against the screens when the moon was high? Each clue led to more confusion. Each warning only deepened the fear. The Tanaka home, once ordinary, had become a place people crossed the street to avoid. And still, no one knew whether the family had left of their own accord or if something far darker had come for them. The longer the house stood untouched, the heavier its presence became. Days turned into weeks, yet the Tanaka home remained frozen in that unsettling state, with the table still set and the walls blackened by soot. What unsettled the neighborhood most wasn't the silence. It was the feeling that the silence was watching, as though the house itself had taken on the role of the family it had swallowed. The authorities, reluctant but pressured by whispers spreading through Kyoto, returned to the property. This time they brought lanterns, scribes, and a few skeptical scholars, determined to catalogue the symbols and close the case for good. But from the moment they slid open the door, things began to shift. The air was different inside, thicker, clinging like damp cloth against the skin. Even the flames in the lanterns bent strangely, as if the air itself resisted light. They entered the dining room first, where the bowls and chopsticks still waited. One officer leaned closer to the table and noticed something he swore hadn't been there before: a faint ring of moisture circling one of the bowls, as though it had only just been set down. Another touched the teapot and pulled back with a startled hiss. It was warm, not scalding but warm, as if reheated moments ago, not weeks. The scholars murmured among themselves, trying to find rational explanations, but their voices were drowned out by a sudden sound. It began as a soft scrape, like fingernails dragging along paper. Then it multiplied, echoing from every wall at once. The soot markings quivered, the black strokes seeming to tremble under an unseen force. A faint chant rose from nowhere, not in human voices, but as if the house itself had learned the ritual and now repeated it. The rhythm matched what the neighbors had heard that night, steady, deliberate, pulling at the edges of sanity. One officer dropped his lantern. It clattered against the wooden floor. Flame extinguished, plunging half the room into shadow. In that moment, everyone swore they saw movement along the walls. Not reflections, not tricks of light. Shadows twisting against the soot, limbs stretching longer than human, faces half-formed and flickering. They weren't the Tanakas, at least not entirely. They were echoes, blurred silhouettes locked in a dance that didn't belong to this world. Panic began to spread. The officers argued whether to retreat, but the scholars urged them to stay, convinced they were on the verge of uncovering something profound. As the chanting deepened, a sudden gust rushed through the room, though no doors or windows were open. The soot markings pulsed, as if alive, spreading slightly, their edges bleeding into the wood, and paper like veins searching for new ground. Then came the moment that shattered what little calm remained. From the staircase leading to the second floor came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, descending one by one. Everyone froze, their eyes locked on the darkened stairwell. A child's voice giggled softly, followed by the unmistakable sound of bare feet padding against wood, but no figure appeared. Instead, the shadows stretched, coiling from the top of the stairs, spilling down like liquid darkness. One scholar, trembling but determined, stepped forward and began reciting a protective sutra. His voice wavered, but for a moment, the chanting in the walls faltered, as if listening. Then, in response, another voice rose, not from the scholar, not from any human throat, but from the air itself. It repeated his words, twisting them, mocking them, layering them back into the rhythm of the ritual. The effect was unbearable. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, screaming that the voices were inside him, not outside. The officers dragged him back, but the damage was done. The house had answered. It wasn't empty. It was participating. Whatever ritual had begun that night with the Tanakas had not ended. It was still running, looping endlessly, hungry for completion. The figures in the walls pressed closer, their hands flattening against the paper screens, leaving behind smears of black that spread like oil. Someone shouted to leave, but as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut on its own. The lantern flames sputtered and died, leaving only the glow of moonlight through the windows. In that pale light, they saw the dining table shift. One of the chairs scraped backward across the floor, slow and deliberate, as though pulled out by invisible hands. Another bowl slid forward. The table was being reset, reenacted, as if waiting for the family to return and sit. It was then that one of the officers noticed something carved freshly into the wood of the table's edge. Another phrase, scratched deep and desperate. "It is not finished. His hand trembled as he traced the letters, realizing they hadn't been there during the first investigation. The message was new, carved after the disappearance, perhaps by a force that wasn't supposed to still be there. The room seemed to breathe, each inhale and exhale pressing against the lungs of everyone inside. The chant grew louder, no longer faint, but resounding, vibrating through the floor. The soot symbols glowed faintly, their edges burning red like embers. And in that heat, in that sound, the investigators understood the terrible truth. They weren't just looking at evidence. They were inside the ritual. Shadows gathered along the walls, rising higher, sharper, until one of them broke free, stretching across the ceiling like a figure unfurling its limbs. It loomed above the dining table, featureless yet unbearably human in its shape. The scholars fell silent, and even the bravest officers could only watch in paralyzed horror as the figure bent slowly, lowering itself toward the table as though about to take its seat. In that moment, the question was no longer what had happened to the Tanakas. The question was whether those now inside the house would meet the same fate. Because the ritual hadn't ended that spring night in 1954, it was still hungry, still unfinished, and it had just found new participants. Weeks turned into months, and the Tanaka case slid quietly from newspaper headlines into whispered folklore. Officially, the disappearance was stamped unresolved, a mystery without evidence. Yet, in the neighborhoods of Kyoto, the story refused to die, each retelling twisted slightly until fact and legend blurred like ink spreading in water. It was during this fading period, when the case seemed destined for silence, that the first revelation surfaced. A retired professor from Kyoto University came forward after reading about the strange markings left on the Tanaka walls. His specialty was religious history, obscure sects, and outlawed traditions. He insisted the characters belonged to a branch of Shugendo that had splintered centuries earlier, condemned for its radical views. This sect believed that the body was a prison, a cage of impurities that trapped the soul. Through extreme purification rituals, fire, chanting, and offerings, they sought to force the spirit free, to send it across the boundary of the flesh into a purer existence. Most sects sought enlightenment through discipline and harmony with nature. This one sought escape through destruction. The soot on the walls, he explained, wasn't random scripture. It was a map of the ritual itself, a sequence meant to guide participants from one stage to the next. The chanting described by the neighbors matched incantations he had seen recorded in outlawed texts, words not meant to be spoken outside of hidden caves. The incense, too, wasn't for prayer. It was to sever ties to the physical, to dull the senses until the body could be abandoned. This revelation reframed everything. The family hadn't simply vanished. They had been drawn, or forced, into a ritual meant to erase them from one world and deliver them to another. Whether they participated willingly or were coerced remained unknown. But the professor made one thing clear. The ritual, as described, was never intended to leave bodies behind. It was meant to leave only shadows, impressions on walls and windows, echoes in the night. The message carved beneath the dining table, "Do not follow," suddenly gained weight. It was no longer just a warning of danger. It was a final plea, perhaps from one family member who realized too late what was happening, a desperate attempt to stop anyone else from stepping into the same path. The dining table set for breakfast, the shoes at the door, the teapot warm on the stove, all of it now looked less like abandonment and more like interruption. They had been in the middle of ordinary life when the ritual pulled them out. The conflicting accounts of shadows also found context. In many Shugendo traditions, shadows were believed to be residues, fragments of what the body leaves behind when the spirit departs. If the ritual had been performed, the flickers in the windows weren't hallucinations, they were remnants, ghostly stains, looping endlessly, caught between disappearance and return. Even the officer who collapsed inside the home, claiming the air pressed against his chest, now seemed part of the puzzle. The professor explained that incomplete rituals often left disturbances in space, like pressure waves that lingered. The murmurs the officer heard may have been fragments of the chant, still vibrating through the house, repeating without end. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation came from the professor's final note. He explained that for such a ritual to succeed, it required an anchor, something to hold open the passage between flesh and spirit. In most accounts, this anchor was a sacrifice, a binding object, or a guiding spirit. Yet, in the Tanaka home, no such object was found. This meant one of two things. Either the ritual had failed, leaving the family trapped between worlds, or the anchor was still there, hidden in plain sight. When the authorities pressed him on what that anchor could be, he refused to say more. All he admitted was that unfinished rituals were dangerous, their anchors capable of drawing others into the same fate. "Do not follow," he whispered, echoing the warning on the table. This partial resolution changed the story completely. The Tanakas weren't just victims of a crime. They were participants, willing or unwilling, in something much older, something darker. The soot on the walls was no longer meaningless graffiti, but a key to understanding their fate. The chanting was no longer strange noise, but an invocation. The incense was no longer a detail to dismiss, but a tool meant to cut ties to this world. And yet, for all this new clarity, the most pressing questions remained unanswered. Who introduced the family to this ritual? Why them, of all people, so ordinary and unremarkable? And if the ritual had failed, what became of their souls? Some whispered that the Tanakas had been taken into the mountains, swallowed by the earth itself. Others believed their spirits still wandered, searching for completion, pulling at anyone who stepped too close to the home. The professor himself offered no comfort. "The ritual was not finished," he said. "That much is certain, and unfinished things, they do not rest." The revelation reframed the case, but it did not resolve it. Instead, it deepened the fear. The soot on the walls, once a curiosity, became a scar. The shadows in the windows, once dismissed, became warnings. And the empty house at the edge of Kyoto became something more than a crime scene. It became a gate, half open, waiting for someone foolish enough to step through. When the investigators finally stumbled out of the Tanaka home, their faces were drained of all color. None of them spoke of what they saw inside. Some carried protective charms from that day forward. Others resigned in silence, never returning to the street again. The official report remained unchanged. The family of 6 had vanished without a trace. No evidence of foul play, no logical explanation. Case closed. But the neighborhood knew better. They had heard the chanting. They had smelled the incense. They had seen the shadows flicker in the windows long after the house had been sealed. And when word spread that the table inside had been reset, bowls and chopsticks moved into new positions, the whispers grew louder. The Tanakas were gone, but something still lingered in that house. The monk returned one final time, standing before the home as if in confrontation. He burned incense on the street, chanting prayers under his breath. When asked if the family was dead, he shook his head. "Not dead," he said, "not alive either. They crossed, but not fully." He refused to explain further, only repeating the same words: "Unfinished things do not rest." Decades later, the house still stands, though no one dares live in it. Curtains drawn, windows cracked, the wood weathered by time. On nights when the moon is high, locals swear they see silhouettes moving through the paper screens. A mother, a father, 4 children. Their forms never clear, always flickering, as though trapped between here and somewhere else. And sometimes, when the wind cuts low through the streets, people claim they hear voices. Not cries for help, not screams, but steady, low chanting, circling endlessly, pulling the air tight around their lungs. Those who hear it don't linger. They walk faster, refusing to look back, afraid that if they do, they'll see the table inside waiting for them, a chair pulled out, a place set. The question that remains is not what happened to the Tanakas. The question is who the ritual will call to next. The Tanaka disappearance was not the only case that left entire communities shaken. Just 8 years later, far from Kyoto, another family would vanish in circumstances just as strange, just as chilling. This time it was Singapore's Chinatown, a place alive with noise, lantern light, and the constant rhythm of trade. Yet behind one locked door, silence fell in a way no one could explain. Like the Tanakas, the Chua family left behind a home frozen in ritual, a scene staged as if they had been preparing for something, or someone. And just as before, the answers were buried under symbols, offerings, and a final message scrawled for those who dared to look. If Kyoto whispered of unfinished rituals, Singapore would scream of ancestors calling. The Chua family lived in the heart of Singapore's Chinatown, a place that in the early 1960s was both bustling and claustrophobic. Narrow shophouses pressed close against one another, their wooden shutters peeling under the humidity, their corridors filled with the smells of cooking oil, dried fish, incense smoke, and rain-soaked pavement. From dawn until midnight, the streets outside the Chua home rang with the clamor of hawkers, the chatter of neighbors, and the occasional rattle of dice tossed in hidden corners. It was a place alive with life, and yet the Chua family's story would turn that life inside out. They were not wealthy, but they were stable. Mr. Chua ran a modest tailoring business from the front of their shophouse, his hands always busy with fabric, his eyes sharp behind thick-rimmed glasses. His wife, Mei Ling, managed the household and looked after their 3 children, all still in primary school. Their laughter often echoed down the narrow stairwell, bouncing into the corridor where neighbors passed by. People described them as ordinary, even exemplary, a family that worked hard and stayed together in a world that often pulled others apart. The shophouse they lived in was typical of the time. 2 levels, wooden beams darkened by years of smoke, walls stained by tropical damp. The ground floor was divided between the shop and a small altar table pressed against the wall, its surface crowded with incense holders, fruit offerings, and faded portraits of ancestors framed in cheap wood. Upstairs were the bedrooms, cramped but functional, their beds pushed close against walls that absorbed every sound from the streets below. But the atmosphere of Chinatown carried more than the pulse of trade and community. Beneath it all lay something older, something superstitious, tied to the cycles of the Hungry Ghost Festival, to the burning of paper offerings, to the belief that the dead were never far away. Even in the brightest hours of day, people whispered about spirits wandering between stalls and altars, slipping into homes through cracks in the doors. Neighbors warned their children not to whistle at night, not to leave chopsticks upright in rice bowls, not to ignore the offerings laid out for ghosts. The Chua family followed these customs casually, like everyone else. They burned incense during festivals, left small plates of rice at the altar, and bowed lightly to the portraits of their ancestors. They did it out of respect, not devotion. There was no sign, no rumor, no hint that they were preparing for anything more, which is why, when they vanished, the shock was doubled. No one could point to strangeness in their lives beforehand. No debts, no quarrels, no scandals. Just a family living in a crowded, noisy neighborhood, working hard, raising children, and keeping to tradition as most families did. Yet the setting of their disappearance cannot be separated from its meaning. In Chinatown, every alley was steeped in ritual. Every doorway seemed to hum with the presence of those who had lived before. And on certain nights, especially during the 7th lunar month, the air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with the belief that the living and the dead walked side by side. It was into this environment that the Chua family's fate was sealed. Their goal was simple: to live, to thrive in a city changing rapidly around them. Singapore in 1962 was no longer a colonial port, but not yet the modern powerhouse it would become. It was a city caught between old beliefs and new ambitions, a place where skyscrapers were only whispers on the horizon, but ancestral altars still dominated every home. The Chuas embodied that balance, their shop representing progress, their altar representing tradition. And yet, on one humid summer night, neighbors heard something that would forever stain the walls of that shophouse with unease. Screams, sudden and sharp, tearing through the clamor of Chinatown. Then the smell of burning joss paper, not the faint, controlled scent of festival offerings, but a heavy, choking odor that clung to clothing and drifted into every corner. Those who lived closest hesitated to look, too afraid of what they might see, too bound by superstition to interfere. By morning, the shophouse stood silent, the door locked from the inside, no sounds of sewing machines, no chatter of children, no signs of movement. Just a heavy stillness that seemed unnatural in a place where noise was constant. And when the police finally broke their way in, what they found inside would unsettle not just the neighborhood, but the entire city. Because the Chuas hadn't simply left. They had left behind a scene that looked less like absence and more like ritual. The first sign that something was wrong with the Chua family came not with their disappearance, but with what the neighbors heard the night before. Chinatown in the early 60s was never quiet. Even after midnight, there were always footsteps on the 5-foot ways, whispers behind shuttered stalls, and the clatter of dishes in back alley kitchens. Yet, on that particular night, the noise around the Chua shophouse seemed to fall away. People who lived on the same row remembered that silence clearly, because it felt unnatural, like the air had been cut off. And into that silence came two things: screams and the smell of burning. The screams came first, short and sharp, like bursts of pain or terror, not the rowdy shouts of gamblers, not the cries of a family quarrel. These were desperate, strangled, and frightening enough to make several neighbors step to their doors. But before anyone could move closer, the second detail swept through the corridor, the heavy, choking odor of burning joss paper. Normally, the thin sheets of paper burned during festivals left behind a faint, almost sweet smoke. This was different. It was thicker, heavier, clinging to throats, forcing eyes to water. It poured out of the Chua home as if entire bundles of paper charms had been thrown into flames all at once. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The screaming ceased. The smoke thinned. When neighbors gathered their courage to peek into the corridor, the shophouse was still. No light shone through its shutters. The door remained firmly closed. And though everyone had heard the cries, no one dared knock. In a place where superstition ran deep, to interfere was to invite danger. So the neighbors returned inside, uneasy but unwilling to cross a line that tradition told them was best left alone. The next morning, the shophouse looked ordinary from the outside. The front door was locked from within, the tailoring shop shuttered as though the family had taken a day of rest. But the absence was immediate. No clatter of sewing machines, no sound of children on the stairwell, no smell of rice cooking in the kitchen. By midday, neighbors began to grow worried. Customers who came for fittings found the shop closed, something unheard of for Mr. Chua, who was known for his punctuality. By evening, whispers spread quickly. The family had not been seen at all. Police were eventually summoned, though with reluctance. In 1962, the authorities were often hesitant to treat such disappearances as anything more than private matters. Still, the locked door was enough to raise suspicion. When officers broke inside, what they found turned the quiet unease into something darker. The front of the house was orderly, as though nothing unusual had happened. Bolts of fabric lay folded neatly, sewing tools placed carefully on the table. Dust had not yet gathered. Everything suggested the Chuas had left only hours before. But it was when they moved deeper inside that the first complication revealed itself. In the living space, on a table pressed against the wall, were offerings laid out as if for the hungry ghost festival. Bowls of rice, plates of roast meat, cups of tea, sticks of incense burned completely down to ash. The problem was, the festival had ended weeks earlier. There was no reason for such a display in the middle of an ordinary month. More unsettling still was the trail. A line of burnt joss paper scraps, brittle and blackened, led directly from the altar table into the family's bedroom. It was laid like a path, deliberate and careful, as though guiding footsteps inward. The officers followed the trail, their boots crunching against ash, until they reached the bedroom. Inside, the scene was even stranger. The beds were empty, but the sheets were rumpled, pillows indented, as though the family had just risen moments before. There was no luggage missing, no signs of departure. It was as though they had simply stepped out and never returned. Then came the detail that chilled the room. Above the altar, painted in deep strokes of red, were the words, "We go where the ancestors call." The paint looked fresh, still glossy in places, but there was no brush, no bucket, no fingerprints left behind. The phrase raised more questions than it answered. Did the Chuas write it themselves? If so, why? If not, then who had entered a house locked from the inside to leave such a message? The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Logic told them to search for secret exits, to look for forced entry, but there were none. Every door was locked, every window barred. No sign of tampering could be found. The family had vanished into thin air, leaving behind offerings, a trail of ash, and a cryptic farewell. For the neighbors who gathered outside, the revelation spread like fire. Some insisted the Chuas had been taken by restless spirits, lured into the other world by rituals gone wrong. Others whispered of debts and secret societies, though none could explain the locked door or the untouched shop. What united them all was the same question, heavy and unanswered. Where had the family gone? This was the first complication. Not just a disappearance, but a disappearance that left behind a stage set for something else. A ritual unfinished, a message unexplained, and a trail that led into a room from which no one returned. The discovery inside the Chua home should have ended the mystery, but instead it only deepened it. The police, reluctant to admit they had no leads, sealed off the shophouse and declared the family missing. Yet Chinatown was not a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. By nightfall, word had already spread through the hawker stalls and narrow corridors, and with the rumors came tension, each retelling adding a new layer of unease. The second strange event occurred only days later, when a policeman was assigned to guard the sealed door. He was young, skeptical of the superstitions that clung to the district. To him, the family had fled, perhaps debts, perhaps shame, and the offerings were nothing more than theater. But when he lit a cigarette and leaned against the doorframe, he noticed something peculiar. Thin curls of smoke drifted out from the cracks of the shuttered windows, even though the house had been untouched since the investigation. He leaned closer, expecting dust or steam, but the smell was unmistakable. Incense. Thick, heavy, clinging. The exact scent neighbors had reported on the night of the screams. When he pushed inside to investigate, the air was stifling, as though the house itself had been burning paper for hours. The offerings on the altar table, rice, roast meat, and cups of tea, looked different. The rice was still steaming. The teacups held fresh liquid, not dried residue. Yet he knew he had stood in this very spot the day before, when the bowls were cold and the cups empty. Word of his discovery spread quickly among the officers, but their superiors dismissed it. The food must have been swapped out by intruders, they argued. Someone must have broken in and staged the scene. Yet the door had remained locked, the seals unbroken, and so the young officer refused to stand guard again. He claimed the house was alive, that it was feeding its altar even without the family inside. This was when the conflicting character appeared. an elderly sinser who lived above a nearby apothecary. He had spent decades preparing herbal remedies and offering spiritual advice to frightened locals. When he heard the details of the disappearance, he insisted the Chua family had not been taken by force, but had chosen to leave. "We go where the ancestors call," he said, repeating the phrase painted on the wall. "That is not a threat, that is obedience." They heard the call of the dead, and they answered. The police mocked him. To them, it was absurd to suggest an entire family had walked willingly into death because of some ancestral whisper. But to the neighbors, his words resonated. They had all grown up with stories of ancestors appearing in dreams, urging the living to honor forgotten traditions, or punishing them when offerings were neglected. If the Chuas had indeed been called, then perhaps their elaborate altar and burning paper charms were not superstition but preparation. Still, one detail didn't fit. A strange clue was discovered by another officer, scribbled faintly in chalk on the inside of the bedroom door. The message was half erased, but a few words were clear. "Not all of us." The chalk was fresh, the handwriting hurried, as though written in panic. But no one could agree on who had written it. If the family had left willingly, why would someone resist? If they had been taken, how did one member manage to leave behind such a note without being noticed? The contradictions only escalated fear. Some whispered that one of the children had resisted, dragging their feet as the rest walked into ritual. Others believed it was the parents who prepared the altar and the children who tried to fight back. The truth was hidden behind locked doors and vanished bodies, leaving only fragments of messages too fragile to hold meaning. The longer the shophouse stood sealed, the stranger the accounts became. Hawkers passing by at night claimed to hear faint voices from within, children reciting prayers, the sound of bowls being set on a table, chairs dragging across wood. A woman swore she saw movement through a shutter crack, a shadow bending over the altar, head bowed as if in prayer. Yet when she blinked, the space was empty. Each night, more people began leaving offerings at their own doors, afraid the spirits that had taken the Chuas would wander elsewhere in search of food. Some avoided the entire street altogether, claiming the smell of incense clung to their skin whenever they walked near. By the second week, Chinatown was divided. To the police, it was an unsolved disappearance. To the locals, it was proof that the dead could still claim the living, and that the boundary between the two worlds was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. But one question lingered, heavy and unanswered, hanging over the trail of ash that led from altar to bedroom. If the Chuas had truly gone where the ancestors called, then why had someone tried to tell the world, "Not all of us"? The decision was made to open the Chua shophouse once more. Too many whispers had spread through Chinatown, too many reports of smoke curling from the shutters and shadows moving behind the barred windows. Authorities wanted to put an end to the rumors, to prove that there was nothing supernatural lurking behind that locked door. But when the team of officers and officials stepped back inside, they carried not only lanterns and notebooks, but also the unease of those who had heard too much. The first thing they noticed was the smell. It was stronger than before, as though the walls themselves had been steeped in incense. The smoke clung to the beams, thick enough to sting the eyes. As they advanced, their boots crunched against something brittle. When they looked down, they saw joss paper scattered across the floor, not just in a trail leading to the bedroom this time, but spread everywhere, as though the entire house had become an altar. The dining table in the center of the room was no longer bare. Offerings were neatly arranged once more, steaming bowls of rice, whole roasted chicken, cups of tea still warm. One officer swore he saw condensation bead and slide down the porcelain, as though the tea had only just been poured. Yet the door had remained locked, the seals intact since their last visit. Someone asked how the food had been refreshed, but no one had an answer. The group split to search each floor. Those who went upstairs to the bedrooms quickly called for the others. When everyone gathered, they found the beds no longer merely rumpled. This time, they looked as though bodies had just risen from them. Sheets were indented, pillows still bore the weight of heads, and in one of the smaller beds, a child's toy lay half hidden beneath a blanket, as though abandoned mid-play. One officer leaned down to touch the mattress and recoiled. It was warm. The chanting began softly, almost like a breeze pushing through bamboo, a low murmur no one could place. They froze, ears straining, trying to pinpoint its source. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It rose from the floorboards, seeped through the walls, spilled down from the ceiling. At first it was faint, but then the rhythm sharpened, layering into something undeniably deliberate, a ritual repeated in voices that were not human, but not entirely inhuman either. One of the scholars who had joined the team, a young man from the university, recognized fragments of the words. He whispered that they matched incantations used during the Hungry Ghost Festival, prayers meant to feed wandering spirits. But there was something wrong with the cadence, an inversion of the lines, a twisting of the syllables. It was as though the ritual had been reversed, not to feed the spirits, but to summon them. Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, descending from the attic stairwell. Every head turned upward as the boards creaked one by one, though the attic hatch had not been opened. The sound grew louder, until it seemed the weight of someone unseen pressed down upon the floor above. And then, with a sharp snap, one of the upstairs shutters flung itself open. A gust of wind burst through the room, scattering ash and extinguishing half the lanterns. In the chaos, someone cried out. On the wall above the altar, where the phrase, "We go where the ancestors call," had once been painted, the words had changed. The red strokes were fresh again, still glistening, but rearranged into something new. They will follow. The room fell silent, every breath caught. The officers scrambled for explanations, paint dripping, someone sneaking in. But the truth was impossible to ignore. They had all been watching the wall moments before. No one had touched it. Yet the message had rewritten itself, as though unseen hands had dipped into paint and scrawled the warning directly in front of them. The young officer who had refused to guard the shophouse last time staggered backward, whispering that the family was still here, not alive, not dead, but circling the altar endlessly. He pointed to the joss paper, now lifting slightly as though stirred by footsteps that no one could see. The sheets fluttered across the floor, forming a new trail, this time leading not just to the bedroom, but circling back toward the door where the investigators stood. The chanting rose again, louder now, filling every corner of the shophouse. It was no longer just prayer, it was command. The scholars covered their ears, muttering protective sutras, but their voices were drowned out. The air grew dense, pressing against their chests, forcing some to their knees. Shadows bent unnaturally along the walls, stretching into shapes that resembled the Chua family, the tall outline of a man, the slimmer frame of a woman, 3 smaller figures huddled close. But their movements were jerky, incomplete, like puppets tugged by strings half cut. One officer shouted to leave, fumbling with the latch of the locked door. But when he pulled, the wood groaned and refused to budge. Another tried the windows, but the bars rattled and held firm. The shophouse had become a trap, and the ritual was tightening around them. Then came the final blow to their composure. From the upstairs room, where the smallest bed had been found warm, came the sound of a child's voice. It was faint, wavering, but clear. Not all of us. The same words that had once been chalked onto the bedroom door. Every head snapped upward. The voice repeated the phrase again, louder this time, until the chant itself seemed to falter in response. The lantern flames guttered and surged. The rice bowls on the table trembled, porcelain clinking against wood. The trail of joss paper ignited suddenly, bursting into flames that raced across the floor in a perfect circle around the investigators. The fire burned without smoke, trapping them in its glow, and for a heartbeat everyone thought they would be consumed. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The chanting cut off, the shadows froze, the flames died, leaving behind only ash. The words on the wall remained, stark and fresh. They will follow. No one spoke. No one dared. But in that moment, every person inside the shophouse understood the truth. The Chuas had not simply vanished. They had been claimed, and whatever force had taken them had marked the living as next. The question was no longer what had happened to the family. The question was how much longer the ritual would wait before calling for more. In the days after the terrifying confrontation inside the Chua shophouse, officials scrambled to contain the story. They issued statements about faulty lamps, mistaken sounds, and the hysteria of too many people crammed into too small a space. But the men who had stood in that circle of fire, who had heard the voice of a child repeating words carved in chalk weeks earlier, were not so easily convinced. Something had happened in that house, something that could not be reduced to superstition. The revelation came from an unexpected place. A visiting historian from Malaya, known for his work on Chinese folk traditions, was called in to examine the evidence. When shown photographs of the altar offerings, the joss paper, and the painted phrase on the wall, he did not flinch. He explained that everything matched rituals tied to the Hungry Ghost Festival, but with a crucial difference. Normally, offerings were made to appease spirits wandering the earth, to feed them so they would not disturb the living. But what he saw in the Chua house was not appeasement, it was invitation. The line of paper scraps leading from the altar to the bedroom, he said, was no accident. In traditional practice, trails of joss paper were sometimes laid during funerals to guide the spirits of the dead safely to the underworld. Here, the ritual had been inverted. Instead of guiding the dead away, it seemed designed to guide the living toward them, to bring the family into the realm of the ancestors. And the phrase painted in red, "We go where the ancestors call," was not a random farewell. It echoed an old belief, rarely spoken anymore, that during the 7th lunar month, the gates of the other world opened not only for the dead to visit the living, but also for the living to cross over if they felt the pull. The ancestors, he explained, could sometimes call their descendants home, not through death in the usual sense, but through ritual surrender. This reframed the entire disappearance. The neighbors' reports of screams were not necessarily cries of terror, but perhaps cries of struggle. Not everyone in the household may have been willing to obey the call. That would explain the desperate chalk message scrawled on the bedroom door. Not all of us. Someone resisted, but the ritual pulled the family together regardless, binding them in a fate none could escape. The historian pointed out another unsettling detail. In Chinese spiritual practice, food offerings that remain warm or fresh long after being set down are taken as signs that spirits have accepted them. The bowls of steaming rice and cups of tea inside the house were not illusions. They were evidence that something on the other side had consumed the offerings and continued to demand them. The altar, in other words, was not abandoned, it was active. Even the strange voices and shifting shadows gained new meaning. In many traditions, shadows are seen as echoes of the soul, remnants left behind when a person crosses over. The flickering outlines seen in the shutter cracks were not tricks of the moonlight. They were the after-images of the Chua family, looping endlessly, caught between the world they left and the world they entered. The historian's words spread quickly, whispered from stall to stall, until Chinatown itself seemed to hum with the weight of the revelation. The Chuas had not been kidnapped, they had not fled. They had crossed, willingly or unwillingly, into the realm of their ancestors. What terrified the community most was the possibility that such a crossing could happen again. The ritual was unfinished, the historian warned. The painted message had changed once before, and could change again. "They will follow" was not a threat from the dead, but a warning. The ritual still sought completion. This understanding reframed the officers' experience as well. The circle of fire that erupted around them, the chanting that rose from the walls, the shadows forming into outlines of the family, all of it was the ritual reaching outward, attempting to draw new participants in. The investigators had not simply witnessed history, they had stepped into it. The Chua family's disappearance was not a closed event, but an ongoing process. For some, the revelation brought a grim sense of clarity. For others, it only deepened the dread. If the ancestors could call, then who among the living might answer next? Was the ritual bound to the Chua bloodline, or could it extend its reach to anyone who entered the house? No one knew. The authorities, desperate to contain panic, boarded up the shophouse and stationed guards at the street. But the locals knew the truth. They avoided the area, crossing to the opposite side of the lane rather than walking past. They left offerings at their own doorsteps, hoping to appease not only wandering ghosts but also the restless spirits of the Chua family who might still roam. And so, the revelation reframed everything. The screams were not random. They were the sounds of a family torn between obedience and resistance. The paper trail was not decorative. It was a guide into the world of the dead. The warm offerings were not staged. They were consumed. The painted phrase was not graffiti, it was the family's final testament. But with that clarity came a new, sharper question. If the Chuas had crossed over because the ancestors called, then why did the message on the wall shift to warn the living? Who, or what, was now doing the calling? And if they will follow was not just a threat but a prophecy, then perhaps the disappearance of one family was not the end at all, but only the beginning. The Chua shophouse was sealed, its shutters nailed shut, its doorway marked with official notices. To the authorities, it was a crime scene closed, a case that would never yield answers. To the neighbors, it was something far worse, a wound in the middle of Chinatown that would never heal. People crossed the street rather than walk past it. Hawkers packed up their stalls earlier than before, unwilling to linger after dark. And even in the chaos of the market, when voices and footsteps filled every corner, the memory of that house remained like a shadow no one could shake. But the story did not end there. Months later, during the next Hungry Ghost Festival, strange reports began again. Smoke was seen curling from the edges of the boarded windows. Some swore they heard the faint sound of chairs scraping across wood, of bowls being set gently onto a table. And one night, a group of children playing nearby claimed they saw red letters glowing faintly on the upper wall of the house. The words were blurred, flickering like flame, but they all agreed on the message. They are coming. Whether it was imagination, trick of the light, or something more, no one could say. The police refused to reopen the case. The boards remained. The notices faded with rain. But the whispers grew louder. The Chua family had not simply left. They had set something in motion. Something that had not yet finished. And so, the house still stands. Its doors locked. Its walls heavy, with smoke that never seems to clear. Locals will tell you not to look too long at its windows, not to pause when walking past, not to listen too closely when the wind carries voices through the alleyways. Because if the ancestors called the Chuas once, who is to say they are not still calling? And if they are, then the real question is not what happened to the family that vanished in 1962. The real question is, who will answer next?